All right, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and we're going to pick up in verse 17, but I want to go back and talk about something we discussed last week. I had this up on the board last week talking about headship, and Adam and I were talking after class, and he brought up something that I thought was really good that I kind of want to go back and pick up and kind of lead us into the study that we do this evening. We talked about the headship that is found in the first part of chapter 11. We talked about, the fact that Christ submits to God, recognizes that his head is God, that every man is to recognize that Christ is his head, and the woman, singular, is to recognize that her man or her husband is her head. I want you to notice in particular verse 7. Notice there in chapter 11, verse 7. For a man ought to have his head covered, since he is the image and the glory of God. So I want you to notice that as we talk about this idea of headship, Paul is introducing the fact that this is glory. If you look in verse 15, if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her as a covering. Why would Paul emphasize this idea that within this headship relationship that he talks about, why would he emphasize the idea of the glory? Well, go back to what we talked about 2 weeks ago in chapter 10. In chapter 10, and look at what he says in verse 31. If somebody could read that, please.
Whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God.
Do all to the glory of God. And in fact, as we kind of touched on that when we talked about it 2 weeks ago, that's really our purpose. As children of God, our purpose, our duty, if you will, but I really prefer the idea, our privilege. Our privilege is that we can glorify God. And so I think that's why Paul, in talking about this headship, and this again draws that connection between these ideas. I mentioned last week that the first part of chapter 11 is somewhat difficult to see the connection with what went before and what comes after. But this is part of that connection. Paul is talking about that which gives glory in this relationship, in this headship, ultimately is to give glory to God. And so that's just something I think is that we always need to keep in mind. And again, I mentioned the fact that this world takes everything that is of God and tries to turn it over. And when we talk about headship the way the world looks at it, what does the world say? To be under someone is a shame. To submit to someone is a shame. But what we find from God is just the opposite. That when we can voluntarily submit to God's way, that's glorious. That is bringing glory ultimately to God. So after talking with Adam, I really thought that was something that I'd like to share with everybody. Anybody with thoughts or comments about that before we move on? All right, we're going to pick up then in verse 17. Very familiar passage to us. We often will look at this passage when we're talking about the Lord's Supper, and for good reason. That's what Paul is doing here. He's talking about the Lord's Supper as it should be, and maybe I got that backwards. So I should say as it was in Corinth, and then what it should be. And obviously it wasn't what it should be in Corinth. So he starts in verse 17, and what's interesting is to notice the contrast. We see this all the time in Paul's writing. If you go back to verse 2 of chapter 11, and he talked about how he was praising them. Back in verse 2, he praised them because they were holding to the traditions that he had delivered to them. The traditions, in fact, that talked about this idea of headship. So what does he say here in verse 17? Yeah, he's essentially taking that praise away that he'd given before. I've mentioned this idea several times as we've gone through the class. We tend to want things to be black, white. Yes, no. Just give me the easy, direct answer. We talked about this as applied with the eating of meats offered to idols. And Paul didn't give them a simple yes or no answer. He gave them a very nuanced and complex answer because life is that way. Well, when you talk about churches that you find described in the New Testament, if we talk about, say, the church in Philippi, we say, well, that was a good church. They were loving, they were generous, they were caring for one another, and a lot of those things are true. They also had two women that didn't get along with each other for a while. So it wasn't a perfect church. They had their issues that they dealt with. When we talk about the church in Corinth, we generally do the opposite. We kind of say, well, boy, that was a church that had all kinds of problems. Who would want to be involved in that church? Well, again, that's not the complete picture. And we see that even in this one chapter where Paul says, I praise you for this, and I don't praise you for this. It's not that Paul's flip-flopping, it's the fact that he's recognizing that churches are complex. The relationships that exist within churches are complex. There's things that they were doing well in Corinth, and he wants to praise them for that. And there's some things that they were not doing well. And he wants to make it clear, I will not praise you for this. I cannot praise you for this. And specifically, what we're going to see in this context is the fact that there were divisions among them. This is not the first time Paul has said this. Back in chapter 1, he said, I've received the report that there are divisions among you. Here he's going to say, I hear that this report. He said, in part, I believe it. We'll get a little bit more and talk about what that in part means. But yeah, there were divisions among them, and he does believe that. But I want to emphasize, first of all, this idea of coming together. Somebody asked me just a little while ago out on the podium, how things are going. I'll be honest, right now, work is hard. I'm just, you have those beat down days, and I've had a week of them. But I knew coming here, why I was coming here, the people that I would be with when I came here, and I feel 100 times better now than I did an hour ago when I left work. Why does Paul say we're supposed to come together? For the better. We're supposed to come together for the better. Now, that's a very open-ended statement by Paul, and I think it's intentional. I don't think he's specifying in which way specifically it's better. It just is better for us to come together. But in Corinth, that wasn't happening. Instead, what does he say? Yeah, it's doing harm. It's not for the better, it's for the worse. They're actually in some way tearing each other down. Remember these statements we've looked at where Paul talked about knowledge puffs up, and what does love do? It edifies, it builds up. Paul talked about himself as an example. He says, everything I do is, I use every method available that by all means I may save some. Everything Paul did was always thinking about, how can I better help somebody else? That's what love does. Love is always looking to see, what can I do that's going to help somebody else? No matter how little, how big it is, it doesn't matter. If it's helping somebody, that's what Christ calls me to do. And yet Paul says about them, they are not coming together for the better, but for the worse. And the reason why is because of these divisions. Now, we've seen these divisions take different forms. In chapter 1, it was divisions over who they were following. In this chapter, we're going to find out the division was the fact that, and taking a meal, they weren't taking the meal together. In fact, they were separating from one another as they take this meal. And so this meal didn't have the purpose that it was intended to. That's why he said, when you come together, coming together by their definition means we're all together. And yet when they're all together, they're doing something that separates. There's just something wrong with this picture. It's like we're all going to gather together so we can all sit in a different corner of the room and be separate from one another. That just doesn't make any sense, but that's what was going on in Corinth. Let's talk about this idea that he believed this in part, that there were factions among them. I think there's two things implied by that statement. In part, I believe it. What two things are implied by that statement? 20? No, 18, excuse me. Verse 18. Somebody says, in part, I believe that. I think one of them obviously is there's some evidence.
I think he wants to be optimistic. Makes sense.
Okay.
In part, that sort of from the beginning, this where he believes that changes can be made.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the evidence that he talks about in chapter 1 had been reported to him by Chloe's people, that there were divisions. So yeah, there's evidence to say there is this divisive attitude. But I find it interesting that he says, in part, I believe it. That suggests to me that he's not taking all of this at face value. And again, that goes back to the point I made earlier, that not everything is a nice, easy, fit it into one category and say, that's the label I'm going to put on it. There was a divisive spirit with some, but it hasn't taken over the entire church. They're not completely divided. There are some tendencies with some to divide. So I kind of look at it again, this is nuanced. There were problems. There clearly was an attitude that shouldn't have been there with some people, but yet it wasn't completely taken over the church. In part, I believe that. Now, that doesn't mean that Paul is minimizing this in any way. In fact, his language is among the strongest things that he says to this church, because this is a very serious matter. A divisive spirit is a deadly spirit in a group of God's people. You just cannot overstate how dangerous that is. Paul is going to use the phrase even to say some of them were asleep, meaning some of them were dead spiritually. So he's going to deal with this, but just recognize that when we read this and we just want to put a label on this church of Corinth, say this is a bad church, a divided church, that may be a little overstating. That may be trying to simplify something that doesn't need to be that simplified. And then in verse 19, I found this part really fascinating. He says, there must be factions among you. Wait a minute, he just talked about the importance of unity. He started this letter with talking about the fact he doesn't want there to be any divisions among them, and yet now he says there must be factions. How do we understand this? Why do there have to be factions? Well, that's true. Everybody has their opinion, but this is more than just simply opinions. Yeah, that you have to see what's wrong, except Paul deals with this actually from the positive side. He says the factions will show the ones you can count on, the ones that are approved. I like the fact that he does that. He deals with this from the positive viewpoint. He says these factions are going to show you the people that are approved by God. Obviously, as he's already talked about a number of times, these are the examples that you need to follow. We all see it. When you go through some sort of a crisis, and one or more people, as the phrase go, keep their head on while everybody else is losing theirs, what do you think of that person afterwards? Steadfast? This is somebody I can trust. This is somebody I can follow. This is somebody that I want to lead us. And I think that's the point that Paul is making here. When these local churches go through these points of crisis and somebody shows themselves as being approved of God because they act with love towards one another, they have grace towards one another, they are keeping control of themselves through those difficult times, they're the examples that God wants us to see. You know, Paul said that back in chapter 11, verse 1. Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. And so that's what I think Paul is getting at. He says, yeah, there's going to be factions. There's going to be dissent. There's going to be these difficult times you go through. But in those times, you're also going to see the kind of people who shine with that bright light of Christianity. This is Matthew 5, verse 16. We think of that in the world, but it also is a light that shines within the local family. And then verse 20. This is the hard one. Therefore, when you meet, it is not to take the Lord's Supper. It took me a few years to really comprehend this statement and what we find in Acts chapter 20 about the church of Troas. But I'm convinced now that first century churches and 21st century churches need to recognize that when they assemble together on the first day of the week, they're meeting for one purpose. And it's not to be impressed by the preacher. They're meeting to take the Lord's Supper. They're gathering together to share in a sacred meal. And so when Paul says, when you meet together, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. It's almost as if he said, you wasted your time, or worse. Because if they're not gathering for the Lord's Supper, then they're not gathering for the Lord. Now, what's interesting is the Lord's Supper here does not have the article in Greek. Again, I don't know Greek. I can only go by what scholars tell us. But the point they emphasize with that is already, by the time this letter was written, the Lord's Supper was recognized by that terminology. It doesn't have to be identified as the Lord's Supper. They already knew it. This is the terminology they use, the same terminology we use today, to talk about this meal. But there's also an interesting thing to contrast it with. So in verse 20 says, you're not meeting together to eat the Lord's Supper. Verse 21, for in your eating, each one takes his supper. This is again one of those plays and words that Paul is so good at. So he says in verse 20, you're not meeting for the Lord's Supper, you're meeting for your supper. And each one of them individually, they were elevating their own needs and wants above the Lord. That's the problem. That's exactly the problem here, is they were thinking of themselves first instead of thinking of the Lord and his disciples. But you're not meeting for the Lord's Supper, you're meeting for your own. You're taking your own supper first. And not only that, verse 22, some people were going hungry. So not only were they eating their own supper, they're also looking at a hungry person sitting across from them who has nothing. That sounds an awful lot to me like the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. You remember how Lazarus was sitting at the gate of the rich man? I mean, this is not somebody that the rich man didn't know anything about. He's sitting right there at his gate. And yet he had nothing. And that's the same thing that was happening in Corinth. You had people that instead of the Lord's Supper, they're thinking of their own supper. And here's somebody in need, and they're not doing anything for them at all. This is not love, is it? Now again, that's nuanced. There's some ways in which they showed love. But this was a problem. And if you're not acting in love, what's the result of it? Division. That's why there's these divisions. And so Paul tells them, said, am I going to praise you in this? This is really not a question for them to answer. He's really saying, is there any way I could praise you for this? No. And once he's described it to them, I think it's clear they understand that. You can't give praise for that kind of behavior. That kind of self-centered, what's best for me behavior. That can't be praised. And so he won't praise it. Any questions then down through verse 22? No, I think I got behind. Yep.
All of that there, is it all talking about the communion meal, the breaking of bread, the cup? Or is it then when he's talking about own meal, goes hungry, gets drunk, are they talking about also another meal?
No, I think this was, in this context, is talking about the Lord's Supper. And I think what he's doing is just showing the kind of ridiculous situation where instead they're putting their own supper first and then not even thinking about others.
Sorry, just to clarify, when you say own supper, is that them taking of the communion just in like their own mind, in their own thoughts?
A very good question. I'm glad you asked that. We need to recognize that sometimes we think of first century with 21st century, culture. I'm absolutely certain they didn't have the individual containers that we have now. Most likely each of the families brought their own elements for the Lord's Supper instead of the church providing for everybody. And so that's within the context. But what had happened was the fact that instead of thinking of this as a spiritual meal, it had become a physical meal. And so instead of just bringing unleavened bread and fruit of the vine for them to take together, they turned it into a feast, just like the culture around them. And so I'm glad you brought that up to help to bring that clear, because in verse 22, he asked the question, do you lack houses? What is so challenging for all of us is to recognize that Christianity is at its base a spiritual religion. It is a religion of the Spirit. Yes, there's physical actions involved, but those actions are driven by the Spirit. And that's especially true with the Lord's Supper. It is a spiritual meal. It's not to take care of my hunger. That's not the purpose, not my physical hunger. Instead, its purpose is to take care of my spiritual hunger, my need to be in fellowship with people who have that same faith and trust in God that I have. And yet what had happened is, I'm sure from the culture around them, the Feast of Aphrodite, all those things were all about gorging themselves. And so that's what the church in Corinth had been doing with the Lord's Supper. They had turned it into a way for them to gorge themselves. And those who could not did without. So that's why Paul says, don't you have houses? Literally, the idea is, are you lacking houses? And he says the purpose of the houses, that's where you take care of your physical needs. That's where you take care of your, if you're hungry, eat at home. But when you come together, your focus, your goal is that spiritual need that you have. And again, that goes back to what I talked about this evening. How much better I am already just knowing I'm with brothers and sisters in Christ. And we share this same faith and we're studying God's word and we're gaining from the wisdom of doing that. That's my spiritual need. Now, just got to find a way to make that bell ring slower. All right, verse 23, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because quite honestly, we do talk about this and we should talk about this every first day of the week. But Paul says, that which I received from the Lord. The term that is used, received here, does not talk about prophecy, but is simply an oral tradition that has been passed down. Now, as far as we know, Jesus didn't literally speak to Paul. Obviously, Jesus already died by the time Paul became a Christian. But even when he spoke to him on the road to Damascus, there doesn't seem to be an explanation of the Lord's Supper there. But that doesn't matter. If someone else, Ananias, I think it was in Acts 9, if someone else had explained this to him, he still received it from the Lord. When we proclaim the message today, when we proclaim the message of the gospel, that's the Lord proclaiming the message. He's just using us as a mouthpiece. And that's the way Paul says here, this is what I received. He emphasized one particular thing here, that it was the night he was betrayed when he taught this. And of course, that is obviously because the purpose of the Lord's Supper is to connect with the death of the Lord. He also talks about the symbolic meaning of the bread and the cup. And sometimes local churches can get all caught up in the physical things, even talking about whether you can have one cup or many cups. That's not the point here. The point is the symbolic meaning. That's what Paul emphasized. He even says, Jesus said when he took it, he said, this is, holding this piece of bread, said, this is my body. No, it wasn't literally his body, but the symbol was his body. And that's the point that's being emphasized. And then the fact that it is to be done in remembrance of Christ. We sometimes say to remember Christ. That's not fully comprehended. It's more like a remembrance, like what we do sometimes with holidays. Memorial Day is a day we are to memorialize or remember those who died in service for our country. That's what Jesus told his disciples. Do this in remembrance of me. And then finally, he says in verse 26, for as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim. Proclaim. What's another translation for the word proclaim? A herald, exactly. An evangelist. That's the Greek word. It's someone who's preaching. When you take the Lord's Supper, you are declaring, proclaiming the death of Jesus Christ. Not just, of course, the death of Jesus Christ, but also his resurrection. And so every time we take the Lord's Supper, we need to understand it is not simply the fact that we can check it off and say it. Philip and Judy probably remember where congregation where I grew up, where they used to be. We'd occasionally, because it was sort of on one of the main roads, we would have people that were traveling on vacation. Yeah, I can remember one story of a family that drove up in the parking lot. The husband got out, went and got one of the ushers in the back of the building and said, "We're on vacation. We're not dressed to come in. Can you have somebody bring the Lord's Supper out to us in the car?" That family didn't have the same view of the Lord's Supper that Paul has. That was just something, make sure we do it on Sunday to say we've done it on Sunday, and the Lord takes, the Lord's got this checklist and he'll put us in his spreadsheet. That's not what we find here. Instead, we find this is the reason they came together. Came together for the better, not for the worse. But then as we get into verse 27, here's where Paul talks about what happens if we don't have that kind of an attitude. If we don't proclaim the Lord's death, if we don't do it in remembrance of him. What's he saying? If you do it in an unworthy manner. Now, people have often misunderstood that unworthy. I'm not worthy to take the Lord's Supper. I'm not going to take it today. That is not what what Paul is saying. He's talking about the means, the attitude that you have when you partake of it. And if you have it with the wrong attitude, then in fact you are guilty of that death of the Lord. Where you proclaim it in glory, if you're doing it in remembrance of him. If you're not doing it, it's just the opposite of that. You're actually guilty of that sacrifice. And then finally, look at verse 30. This is the one that really struck me. I got a little bit ahead or a little bit behind again. Verse 30, for this reason, many among you are weak and sick. Anybody know what scurvy is? I think a pharmacist would know. What's scurvy?
Well, we're basically understanding it's like vitamin C.
Exactly. I was doing some research on that. It turns out that at the time that sailors started sailing long distances where they were far away from fruits and vegetables, some of those trips lost more than 3/4 of the sailors that died from scurvy until they finally figured out they didn't know it was vitamin C. They just knew lemon juice. So that's what's going to keep them all alive. Malnutrition. That's what it is. That's malnutrition. Do we understand what Paul is telling us here? For this reason, if you're not taking the Lord's Supper rightly, you're dying spiritually. Or in some cases, he said, you're already dead. That's why I say this is important stuff. We've got to understand what this means. But the opposite of that is also true. If we do judge it rightly, then we're eating a balanced diet spiritually. And we're going to grow stronger. We're going to come together for the better. Anybody with thoughts or comments? I'm sorry I ran a little bit long, but I wanted to get into that. All right, next week we'll start talking about spiritual gifts.